I'm sorry, Claire, the principal said quietly, her voice clipped and final. Your words are a bit too personal. She didn't raise her voice. Claire just stood there clutching the folder against her chest, the one her father had written in before he left for his final deployment. All she wanted was to read a letter from a Marine who never came home. But the room went quiet. No one stood up. No one defended her. Until the next morning when 6 black SUVs and the command jeep rolled up to the school. Then a long white bus filled with men and women in uniform, many leaning on cane, some silent in dress blues, all standing in tribute. This is the story of a girl who refused to let silence bury her father's memory, and the day a quiet town remembered what honor really means. Claire Bennett was 12 years old the morning everything changed. She lived in a modest 2-bedroom farmhouse on the edge of a quiet Virginia town, far enough from the city to hear the wind in the trees, but close enough to smell diesel on the breeze when school buses rumbled by. The house had belonged to her grandparents for nearly 50 years, and after her father's final deployment, it was the only place that still felt like home. Her grandmother, Martha Bennett, was the kind of woman who ironed her tablecloths and still mailed birthday cards with handwritten notes. Strong, steady, and a little stern around the edges, Martha had raised Claire with the same care she once gave to her garden watering, what was fragile, pruning, what was stubborn, and never backing down from a storm. Life hadn't been easy for either of them since Daniel Claire's father had been laid to rest beneath the oak trees in the veterans section of Maple Hill Cemetery. Daniel Bennett had served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, a Marine through and through. His uniform still hung in the hallway closet, pressed and untouched like a memory sealed in fabric. There weren't many pictures of him in the house. Claire's grandmother said it was too hard, but his presence was everywhere. His boots were still by the back door. His coffee mug, chipped at the rim, sat above the sink, still holding his last pair of dog tags like a shrine. Claire didn't talk much about the day they got the news. She had been 9 years old when 2 Marines in dress blues came to the house. She remembered the sound of gravel crunching under their boots. She remembered the way her grandmother's breath caught in her throat before they even spoke. But more than anything, Claire remembered the envelope they handed her. Not to Martha, not to the family, to Claire. It was a letter, a single page, folded twice, written in her father's steady, squared handwriting. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even long, but it ended with a sentence she never forgot. Tell them who I was. Tell them why I served. She'd read that line so many times it had started to feel more like a mission than a message. Not just something he wanted her to know, but something he needed her to do. So she wrote. For months she worked on that speech. Tucked into the corner of the worn kitchen table with a pencil and lined notebook paper, she shaped the words that would honor her father's legacy. She didn't write for applause. She didn't write to be noticed. She wrote because he had asked her to. And for Claire Bennett, that was reason enough. It was a cool Monday morning when Claire decided she was ready. She had practiced the speech dozens of times aloud in her bedroom, whispered in the quiet corners of the barn, and once in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening. But her grandmother had been. Martha didn't say much afterward, just nodded once and said he'd be proud. That was enough. The school was buzzing with activity that week. Veterans Day was approaching, and Ridge Creek Elementary was preparing its annual assembly, complete with songs from the 4th grade choir, patriotic posters along the hallway walls, and a carefully curated lineup of pre-approved student speakers. The school liked safe stories, ones about grandfathers who'd been cooks in World War II, or uncles who wore uniforms but never saw battle. Claire's story didn't fit that mold. Her father's letter wasn't light or nostalgic. It was raw. It was real. And it ended with a line that refused to be ignored. Tell them who I was. Tell them why I served. Claire didn't tell anyone she was planning to ask for a speaking slot, not even her grandmother. She simply slipped her folded pages into the folder he had once carried, still worn with creases, and his name stamped faintly on the front, and walked straight into the front office before homeroom. Principal Elaine Carter was already in her seat, her coffee cup steaming, her blazer perfectly pressed. She smiled when Claire entered, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. Claire, what can I help you with? Claire's hands trembled slightly, but her voice didn't. I'd like to read a speech for the Veterans Day Assembly. Principal Carter paused mid-sip. Oh, what's it about? It's about my dad, Staff Sergeant Daniel Bennett. The principal's smile faltered. Claire continued. He was killed in action 3 years ago. He left me a letter asking me to tell people why he served. I want to read that. Principal Carter sighed quietly and gestured to the chair across from her. Claire, I admire your courage. I really do. But Veterans Day can be a very emotional time for young students. We try to keep the assembly light. Uplifting. Claire blinked, not quite sure what to say. The stories we feature, well, they're meant to be more general. Your piece might be a little too personal, maybe even upsetting to some of the children. Claire didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. She just nodded, rose from her seat, and walked out folder, still clutched to her chest like a shield. George Miles, the school's custodian, an older man with a quiet presence and a veteran himself, watched her from down the hall. He didn't know what had just happened, but he could tell by the look in her eyes that something had been taken from her. Something more than just a speaking slot. At recess, Claire sat alone on the edge of the playground. The swings creaked in the breeze and laughter echoed from the far field, but she didn't move. She opened the folder, pulled out her speech, and read it to no one but the wind. George stood at a distance watching. There are moments, he thought, when silence can be louder than any applause. And this quiet, determined girl with her father's words in her hands was making more noise in that stillness than 1,000 voices ever could. And deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next day, just after the final bell, Claire didn't walk home with the others. Instead, she turned down the side path behind the school, where the cracked pavement faded into tall grass and pine needles. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and old leaves, and the sky had gone gray, as if the weather understood what she was about to do. George Miles stood by the janitor's shed, pretending to fix the latch on the door, but he saw her. She moved with quiet determination, boots crunching beneath her as she passed the edge of the playground and disappeared beyond the fence line. He didn't call out. He didn't follow, not right away. He knew where she was going. Maple Hill Cemetery sat just a quarter-mile beyond the trees. Small, simple, and mostly forgotten by the town, it held more stories than anyone ever bothered to ask about. One of those stories rested beneath a modest marble marker near the far end, where the ground sloped slightly downward and the trees formed a quiet canopy overhead. Claire found the grave like she always did, by memory, not by sight. She knelt slowly, setting her folder down in the grass beside the headstone. The ground was cool and slightly damp, and she tucked her hands into her sleeves to keep from shaking. The headstone read, Staff Sergeant Daniel Bennett, Father, Marine, fallen but never forgotten. She traced the name with her fingers, then opened the folder and unfolded her speech. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. You told me to tell them who you were and why you served. You said you didn't want a flag waving without a story underneath it. So this is your story, Dad. And I hope it's enough. George arrived a few minutes later, standing just far enough away to give her space. He didn't make a sound. He just watched, his cap pressed against his chest, the wind tugging at the loose ends of his jacket. Claire read every word. She paused once when her voice cracked but never stopped. Her hands shook, and once she had to wipe her eyes with her sleeve, but she made it to the final sentence. You served so people could speak freely, and I'll keep speaking because you can't. When she finished, she pressed the pages gently against her chest and closed her eyes. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, barely a whisper, she added, I did it, Daddy. She placed the folded speech at the base of the headstone and stood. Her shoulders were straighter now, not lighter but more certain. George watched her walk away without looking back. When she was gone, he stepped forward, kneeling by the grave. I never met you, Sergeant, he whispered, but your girl's got more fight in her than half the Marines I served with. He stood up slowly, his knees protesting the cold ground, and looked out across the cemetery. The town had forgotten this corner. The school had tried to forget her voice, but George hadn't, and now he had a phone call to make. That night, the house was quiet. George Miles sat alone at his kitchen table, an old cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The overhead light flickered slightly, casting soft shadows across the wood grain. In the corner, the television played a rerun of an old war documentary, but the volume was muted. He wasn't watching. His eyes were fixed on a folded piece of paper in front of him. Claire's speech. He'd picked it up after she left the cemetery, brushing away the damp leaves before carefully tucking it inside his coat. She had read it with more strength than most grown men he knew. Not because she wanted attention, but because she was keeping a promise made in the dying breath of a Marine who never got to come home. George ran his thumb along the edge of the page and sighed. Then he walked over to a small drawer near the pantry and opened it. Inside was an old flip phone, worn and dusty. The kind they didn't sell anymore. It hadn't been charged in years, but George always kept it just in case. He plugged it into the wall. The screen blinked to life, blue and dim, but still working. He scrolled slowly through the saved contacts, past names that once filled barracks and bases. Names that used to shout over helicopters, laugh in the dark, and past stories around campfires in places that didn't exist on any tourist map. He stopped on one. Gunny Harper. The name brought a small smile to his lips. Gunny was retired now, living upstate with 2 bad knees and a dog that didn't like visitors. But if anyone could make a few calls and pull a few strings, it was Harper. George hesitated for just a second. Then he hit dial. The phone rang once, then again, then a third time. A click. Yeah, the voice was gravel and grit, older now, but unmistakable. "It's Miles, George," said his voice quiet. "From Echo Company." A pause, then a short chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned. Thought you'd fallen off the map." "I almost did," George admitted. But something came up. He told him about Claire, about the principal, about the speech she wasn't allowed to give, and the grave she sat beside while reading it anyway. He told him about the silver pendant she wore, the one from her father's last deployment. He told him how she didn't cry, not in front of anyone, not even when they tried to silence her. Harper didn't interrupt. He listened. When George finally finished, there was silence on the line. A long one. Then Harper spoke just 3 words. "We'll be there." George's chest tightened, not with grief, but with something else, something steadier. "You sure?" he asked quietly. "You just give me a time. I'll handle the rest." George nodded, though no one could see it. Veterans Day Assembly. Friday morning? He ended the call. Set the phone down gently. Outside, the wind rustled the porch flag. Inside, George stood still, staring out into the dark with something fierce in his heart. Because now Claire wasn't alone. Veterans Day morning dawned cold and windless. The sky hung low and gray over Ridge Creek Elementary, casting long shadows on the frosted lawn. Teachers shuffled into the building with coffee cups and lesson plans, expecting just another routine assembly filled with patriotic songs and rehearsed smiles. No one was expecting what was coming. Except George. He was already at the gate by 6:00 a.m., broom in hand, pretending to sweep the walkway, but mostly watching the road. His old Marine jacket flapped softly in the breeze. His eyes, tired but sharp, were fixed on the bend in the road, where town traffic usually started around 7. Nothing yet. Inside, the final touches were being made in the auditorium. Paper flags taped to the stage microphones tested and retested. Principal Carter was reviewing the schedule, making sure everything ran tight and clean. Claire Bennett's name wasn't on the list. It never had been. Claire arrived just before 8, walking quietly beside her grandmother Martha. She held her folder close again, just like she had that day in the principal's office. Her silver pendant caught the pale light as she stepped through the front door. She didn't speak. Neither did Martha. Back outside, George's breath misted in the air as he watched the horizon. Then he heard it. The low, steady hum of engines, not loud, not hurried, but deliberate, like something arriving with purpose. The first vehicle crested the hill, a black SUV, polished but unassuming, its windows tinted. It rolled slowly into view and came to a stop along the curb in front of the school. Then another, then another. By the time the 6th SUV joined the line, the street had fallen silent. No honking, no fanfare, just idling engines and solemn intent. Behind them came an older command jeep, followed by a long white bus plane without markings, but packed with shadows that moved like men who had seen too much and still stood tall. George took off his cap, hand to heart. From the office window, Principal Carter's brow furrowed. Teachers stopped mid-conversation. Students pressed their faces against the hallway windows, pointing. "What's going on?" someone whispered, but no one had an answer. Then the doors began to open. One by one, men and women stepped out, some in full dress, blues, others in worn field jackets, bearing patches faded with time. They were old, young, limping, straight-backed. Some needed canes. One had a prosthetic leg. All had the same look in their eyes' purpose. They lined the sidewalk shoulder to shoulder, silent as stone. They didn't chant. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their presence was louder than any protest. Inside the auditorium, the hum of excitement turned to unease. Students quieted. Teachers exchanged glances. Principal Carter stepped up to the podium and tapped the mic, her voice thinner than usual as she reminded the audience to stay calm and respectful. But even she couldn't ignore what was happening beyond the doors. Claire sat in the second row, her hands resting on her lap, the folder tucked beneath them. She didn't look surprised. She just looked ready, because she knew. George had kept his promise, and her father's brothers and sisters in arms had come not to make noise, not to disrupt, but to bear witness, to make sure one voice wouldn't be buried by silence. They had come to stand behind the girl who had stood alone. The auditorium was packed. Folding chairs lined the aisles, everyone filled with students dressed in red, white, and blue. Some wore paper hats or hand-colored flag pins. Others just fidgeted in their seats, unsure why the adults around them suddenly seemed so tense. Claire sat quietly in the second row, her grandmother beside her. Martha's hands rested on her cane, but her eyes were fixed straight ahead, alert, unwavering. George stood at the back near the double doors, his arms crossed loosely, his old Marine jacket zipped halfway up. The Veterans Day program began just as it had in years past. Fourth graders sang "God Bless America." A fifth grade student recited a short poem. Principal Carter stood at the podium, smoothing her notes, smiling tightly after each performance. Everything was on schedule. Everything was controlled, until it wasn't. A hush rippled through the room as the last student speaker stepped down and Principal Carter returned to the microphone. Her voice was calm, but her posture betrayed her nerves. She cleared her throat. "Thank you, students, for your thoughtful tributes," she began. "This concludes our scheduled presentations. There will be no additional speakers today." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Claire's eyes didn't blink. She reached down, pulled the folder onto her lap, and stood. The room held its breath. Principal Carter froze for a moment, then recovered. "Claire, I'm sorry, but you're not on the program. Please take your seat." Claire didn't move. From the back of the room, George stepped forward just slightly, just enough for the door to ease open behind him. And then the veterans began to enter. They didn't march. They didn't announce themselves. They simply walked in quiet and deliberate, filling the walls of the auditorium one by one. Some stood near the exits. Some flanked the stage. One older man, his back bowed with age, stood at the center aisle like a sentry. Principal Carter's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Then the veterans began to remove their gloves. One by one. They folded them in their palms with practiced care, then placed bare hands over their hearts. Their eyes, each and every one, turned to Claire. She looked to her grandmother. Martha nodded barely. Claire took a step forward. Principal Carter's voice rose again, just a bit sharper now. "Claire, this isn't appropriate." But the room had already stopped listening. Even the students, normally restless, sat still. There was something sacred about the silence. Something unspoken but undeniable. Claire reached the microphone and placed her folder on the podium. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. "I was told this was too personal," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But my father didn't die for general statements. He died with a letter in his pocket written for me." She paused, "And he asked me to tell you who he was." Behind her, a wall of veterans stood silent and still, their hands pressed to their chests. In that moment, no one dared interrupt, not even the principal, because they all knew this was no longer an assembly. This was remembrance. Claire stood at the podium, her small fingers gripping the edges of the folder that had once belonged to her father. The stage light cast a soft glow across her face, catching the glint of the silver pendant resting just below her collarbone. The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from boredom or waiting, but the kind that held reverence. You could almost hear people breathing slowly, cautiously, as if they didn't want to break whatever sacred moment had begun. Claire looked down at the paper, then up at the rows of students, teachers, and finally the veterans standing like statues along the walls. She began. "My father's name was Staff Sergeant Daniel Bennett. He served in the United States Marine Corps for 12 years. He missed 3 of my birthdays. He missed my first piano recital. But he never missed the chance to tell me why he served." Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The words carried. He said serving wasn't about being brave. It was about doing the hard thing, even when it would have been easier to walk away. He said real strength wasn't in your arms. It was in keeping a promise. She paused just for a breath. Then she unfolded the last part of the speech, written in her father's handwriting, copied by her trembling hand onto lined paper. Before his final deployment, my father left me a letter. It said, "If I don't come home, tell them who I was. Tell them I loved you. Tell them I believed in something bigger than myself. And whatever you do, don't be quiet." Claire looked out over the room, eyes wet but unblinking. So today I'm keeping that promise. I'm not here to make anyone uncomfortable. I'm here because someone had to stand. And I guess that someone is me. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "I speak because he no longer can." At those words, the veterans lined up shoulder to shoulder, lifted their hands in unison. Not to salute the flag, not to salute the school, they saluted her. Every man and woman, some with shaking arms, some with tears in their eyes, raised their hand to their brow and held it there. Claire let the final line of her speech fall from her lips in a whisper, "Meant for the heavens, I love you, Dad." She gently closed the folder and stepped back. No one clapped. No one moved. Because in that moment applause would have felt too small. Instead, heads bowed, hands lowered over hearts, and silence stretched like a ribbon across the room, soft and heavy, beautiful and unbearable. Claire walked slowly back down the steps. As she passed the veterans, they nodded to her, one by one, eyes filled with something deeper than thanks. Not a single student laughed or whispered. Not a single teacher looked away. She had said what needed to be said, and somehow it was enough. The assembly didn't end with a dismissal. There was no music, no polite announcement, no call to return to class. The room remained still, suspended in a silence more powerful than applause. Claire had returned to her seat beside her grandmother, her face calm but her eyes shining with the weight of what she had just done. The veterans stayed in place for a long moment. Then without a word they began to move. Not all at once, but one by one. An older man in a faded Vietnam-era uniform stepped forward first. His gait was slow, stiff from age or injury, but his presence filled the room like thunder. He approached the edge of the stage and removed a patch from the shoulder of his jacket, threadbare, the colors nearly gone. He set it down gently at the foot of the podium, then stepped back, saluting in silence. Another veteran followed. A woman this time, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun beneath her beret. She reached into her coat and withdrew a letter. Its edges yellowed the paper soft with time. She laid it beside the patch. A third stepped forward, this one younger perhaps, Gulf War era. He placed a photograph, a black and white image of a unit standing together in a desert dust, in their hair and pride in their eyes. They came in quiet waves, not to be seen, not to be honored, but to leave something behind. Something that spoke louder than speeches. A purple heart pin, a folded flag badge, a set of worn dog tags resting atop a handwritten note. Each gesture was deliberate, each offering sacred. Claire watched her hands folded in her lap, her chest rising and falling with quiet emotion. She didn't cry. Not now, not here. But something inside her shifted, something heavy that had lived in her since the day her father didn't come home. George stood at the back, his eyes damp, his cap held tightly in his hands. He had never seen anything like it, not in all his years in uniform, not in all the ceremonies he had attended. Because this wasn't ceremony. It was something purer, something deeper. It was remembrance. When the last of the veterans stepped forward, he left behind a single white rose. No note, no name, just a flower laid at the altar of a child's courage. The students, many of whom had never understood what Veterans Day truly meant, now sat wordless. Something had changed. They might not have had the words for it yet, but they felt it. In their hearts, in their silence. As the veterans began to file out quietly, respectfully, one reached out and gently touched Claire's shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She looked up and nodded, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you for remembering him." The man gave a small nod in return, his eyes glistening. Then he turned and walked away. And in that moment, Claire knew her father's story hadn't been buried. It had been passed on. After the last veteran left the auditorium, the school remained still. No one rushed to rearrange the chairs. No bell rang. Even the teachers, usually quick to resume order, stood in small clusters, unsure of what to say, as if speaking might undo something sacred. Claire and her grandmother stepped outside into the cold November light. The air was crisp, the sky still gray, but the weight in Claire's chest had changed. It no longer dragged her down, it grounded her. George Miles stood by the flagpole, his hands tucked into his jacket, watching them. When Claire passed, she looked up at him. "You did good, kid," he said softly. She didn't answer, only smiled, and in that smile was a kind of peace he hadn't seen on her face before. Behind the school, near the edge of the lawn, a small table had been set up for the Veterans Day assembly. Claire wandered over to it, slowly, her boots pressing into the frosted grass. On the table now rested more than a dozen items, tributes left behind by the veterans who had come for her. A faded cap, a prayer card, a handwritten note pinned to a folded ribbon that read, "To the next generation, may you always remember." Claire reached out and gently placed her hand on top of the pile, as if absorbing every story, every sacrifice, every silent promise. And then she saw it, a bouquet of white chrysanthemums resting beneath her father's name on the memorial plaque. Tucked inside was a small card. The handwriting was square and careful. "We remember him as we remember our own." She held the card for a long moment, then pressed it against her chest, just as she had with her father's letter. George watched from a distance, his eyes damp, his breath catching against the cold. For years he had guarded the school, fixed leaky faucets, swept forgotten corners. But today he had witnessed something far more important. A girl barely taller than his shoulder had reminded an entire town what it meant to serve. Not with a weapon, but with her voice. And from that day on, no one at Ridge Creek Elementary would ever forget the morning silence turned into memory and a daughter's promise turned into legacy. In today's world where voices often compete to be the loudest, Claire reminded us that sometimes the quietest voice is the one that carries the deepest truth. She didn't demand attention. She didn't argue. She simply stood her ground for her father, for memory, for honor. And in doing so, she awakened something long buried in all of us, the power of remembrance. Maybe the real question isn't just who served, but who still remembers. We live in a time where stories fade fast, replaced by headlines scrolled past in seconds. But what happens when a child refuses to forget? When an entire room pauses for silence instead of noise? That's what this story leaves us with. And now we ask you, have you ever witnessed a moment like this? Have you ever stood up when others told you to stay quiet? Or maybe, is there someone in your life who deserves to be remembered but hasn't been? We want to hear from you. Scroll down and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us your story. Tell us who you remember. And help keep these moments alive, because memory is a kind of service too. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story moved you, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to our channel. We're honored to tell these stories, and we hope you'll continue the journey with us. Until next time, remember the quiet ones. They often carry the loudest truths.